Hi class, welcome back. We're gonna go over example 3, how to factor a trinomial when the leading coefficient is other than 1, right? So in this case, we have a 10. So this complicates the process or the guessing a little bit further. At this point, I do not recommend doing the guessing. I think you will save more time by following the following system. This is called the AC method. Sometimes you may refer this as the box method, but I really don't. I'm not familiar with the box way to do it. So I'll start consistent with the AC method. All right, so why is it called AC method? AC method is referred to the coefficients of this trinomial. Once you put this in order, that means by putting this in descending order, right? Then it is established that this is known as the A coefficient. This is known as the B coefficient, and then this is known as the C coefficient. So in this case, A is 10 because it compares to the A coefficient. In this case, B is negative 11 because it's comparable to, if you compare X with the X, this needs to be the same. And then in this case, the C will be minus 6, right? So that's where the AC method is just the where we get these numbers. So let's begin. All right, so we're gonna do this is gonna be a little bit different than the other one. We're actually gonna break this into a grouping. But the goal is to have this, right? Is to have this binomial times binomial, right? We already mentioned that before, that in order we can write a trinomial in the factor form of a binomial times a binomial. Anyways, so what we're gonna do here real quick is we're gonna try to break this trinomial and divide it into 4 terms. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna take the first term, and it's just going to carry the last term, the third term here. The constant term is also going to be carried. So what our goal is to do is to separate this middle term. So this term needs to add up to be 11x minus 11x. So this, we don't know what's going to be here, but we need to subdivide it into 2 terms. So what we do know is that in order for these 2 terms to add up to minus 11x, we know for sure that they need to both be x's, right? They both need to be having it's going to need to be a term of an x, right? So what we need to figure out is what is this number and what is that coefficient, right? What number? So that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to find those two numbers. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a let me make the cross over here. We're going to call this A times C. I'll write it as A times C and this as my little b. All right, so first take your A. A is, we mentioned 10. So you take 10 and multiply it by your C, which is negative 6. So if you multiply those together, that gives you negative 60. Right, so that's the negative 60. And then your B in this case happens to be 11, negative 11. All right. So what we're going to try to do is find those two numbers that when you multiply them, the product of these two gives you negative 60, but when you add them together, it gives you a negative 11. So let's find these two numbers. All right, so let's ignore for now the sign of the 60. So we're looking for two numbers that when you multiply them gives you negative 60. So like we said before, we start with 1. 1 times 60 gives you 60. 2 times 30 gives you 60. 3 times 20 gives you 60. 4 times 15 gives you 60. 5 times 12 gives you 60. 6 times 10 gives you 60. 7 times something does not give you 60. 8 times something does not give you 60. 9 times something does not give you 60. 10 times 6 gives you 60, but we already have that combination here, so that tells us that we can stop. So now we have to figure out which number will have, which side will have the negative and which side will have a positive, or what kind of sign would they have. So we know that the product of these two numbers needs to give you a negative number. So the only case is whether the left side is negative and then multiply by the right side, which is a positive, right? That's the only way you can get a negative number. Or if you get a positive on the left side, these are all positive, and then these numbers are all negative, right? That's how we can get a product of negative. But we know that when you add them together, when you add a negative plus a positive, and if you notice, these are the small ones, right? If you notice, these are small, these are bigger, so these are the big. So if this is your small and this is your big, right, then a negative plus a positive, a bigger positive, then that will give you a positive number, right? The bigger always stands up. Well, that didn't work. So what about if we try the second case where we have a positive that is small added to a negative that is big, and that's G. All right. So if the negative is bigger than the positive, so when you add them together, the negative will overcast the positive, so that will be a negative, right? So the only way we can get a sum of negative is that the bigger number, right? The bigger number is negative. So that means that this is going to be the case. So we have positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. So when you add them together, this gives you negative 59. When you add these two together, it gives you negative 28. When you add these together, it gives you negative 17. When you add these together, it gives you negative 11, which is the number we wanted. But we're just going to continue here, negative 7, and then negative 4. And I just went on and did the rest of it because just to show you that there's no other combination, right? This is the combination that we're looking for, and that's all we're gonna need. So that means that these two numbers are going to be positive 4 and negative. So plus 4x minus 15x. There you go. All right, so we found the two numbers. Now, if you're asking yourself, wait, how does he know you have to put the 4x here and not on the second option, right? How come 4x does not go here? And then having here negative 15x. Why not this order? It actually does not matter. You can try either way, either order, and it will still work. The middle terms will look different than mine, but at the end you'll still get the same result. Okay, so now we went from a trinomial, right, 3 terms, to a 4 terms, right? And if you remember that from factoring before, is that we can try to do this by factor by grouping. Whenever you have 4 terms, you can factor by grouping. Now this is not a very common thing to do. We do factor by grouping for a purpose, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna separate these two together as being one group, and then these two together as being another group. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's just focus here. What does these two factors have in common? Right, what these two terms, what do they have in common? What factors do they have in common? Well, if notice 10 and 4 are both divisible by 2, right? So 2 is a common factor. And if you notice, also they have a factor of x, right? This one has more products of x than this one, but nonetheless, they do have a 2x as a common factor. So if you factor out a 2x from a 10x square, well, let's just go one at a time. If you factor a 2 from a 5, If you think about it, 10 is the same thing as 5 times 2. So 10 has a factor of 2. So if you factor out the 2 from the 10, what's left behind? The other factor, right? You factor out, so technically visualize this as 5 times 2, right? And you factor this 2 out, what's left behind? The 5. So there you go. So 5 is left behind. This is the same thing, x times x, right? It's x squared. If you factor one of the x's, then what's left behind? The other x, followed by the plus. And if you factor a 2 from the 4, remember that 2 times 2 gives you 4. So if you factor one of the 2's, then you're left with a 2 behind. If you factor an x, right, there's only one x, so you're left with a 1 here, right? So there you go. So you have 5x plus 2. We're not going to rewrite that product of 1, but it is there. So we are done with the first group. Now we're going to do the second group. What I would suggest is that this is going to be another term. So this is also going to factor. It's going to be factor, because if we do this correctly, actually there's something amazing is going to happen. If we did this correctly, and by the way, there's going to be a plus or a minus here that separates those two groups. If we did this correctly, we guarantee that this factor here is going to be the same as this one right here. So that would be 5x plus 2. You're thinking, no, wait a minute, how does he know? Well, it's because if we did everything correctly, that will work out that way, right? It's guaranteed to always work, or I'll give you your money back. And so what you need to do here, and we'll double check that we have this, but what you need to do here is just figure out what number goes here. So, and it's actually not so bad to guess the number. So we need to multiply a number times positive 5x. When you multiply these two numbers together, it should give you negative 15x. Well, what number needs to be multiplied by 5 to get a 15? Well, you guessed it, and that is 3, right? 3. But 3 times 5x gives you 15x, but does not give you the minus. So what we need to do is make sure that that is also a minus. So it will be a minus 3, right? Not a negative 3, is a minus. And let me tell you this, that a lot of times, most of the time, students will forget about this number, right? There is always a minus or a plus here. And let's double check, right? So if you take minus 3 times 5x, that will give you negative 15x. Now what about minus 3 times positive 2? It does give you negative 6. So it works, right? So we factor without even factoring, because I knew what I was looking for. I knew that it needed to be that way. So anyway, so let's just go back here 1 second. Now what's the next step? The next step is to factor further. So we went from, let's recap. We went from 3 terms to 4 terms, right? And we remember that how we separate terms by pluses, minuses, right? Pluses or minuses. So now we went to a 2 term. If you notice, this is one single term minus this other term. So we only have 2 terms. So now before we move on to here, I'm gonna just do a quick example here. If I had, let's say, if I had 2x times, let's say, a very specific number, let's say 7, and I add this to, or subtract this to, minus 3 times 7, right? If I had this, and I ask you, can you factor can you factor the 7? And you guys will think, well, yeah, of course I can factor the 7. They both have, these two terms both have a 7 as a common factor, right? 7 is the common factor, so you can factor it out. So if you factor out that 7, right? If you factor out that 7, let me put this in a different color. If you factor that 7 out, oh, sorry, factor that 7, right, like this, then what's left behind? What's left behind is going to be these two numbers. So you're left with 2x minus 3, but what you need to do is remember that you need to group them together. So why do we need to group them together? Because in order for you to go backwards, you need to make sure to distribute this 7 to both of them, right? So it just goes like undoing the distribution, right? It's just factorization is the process of going backwards in a distribution. So just remember that we always have to put a parentheses when you are factoring something out. So if you think about it, this is what we are factoring, right? Those two terms, and let me point it out. This term has 2x as a factor, right? It's a factor, and then it has the other number as a factor as well, right? So these are two factors, and then this term has a negative 3 as a factor, and then it has 5x plus 2 as a factor. So we can agree that 5x plus 2 is going to be the common factor between both terms, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to factor out this term. We're going to factor out this common factor, 5x plus 2, just like we did over here, right? But we have to be careful, and we're going to make sure that whatever's left behind is it stays within the parentheses, right? It's going to be grouped together. They're going to be grouped together because, again, if you want to go backwards, you can by using distribution, right? You multiply this 5x plus quantity 5x plus 2 to the 2x, and then again the quantity 5x plus 2 times negative 3, and you'll get back to that. So if you notice, what we ended up doing here is we factor to binomial. Now you might need some time, an extra time to digest that part. This is not very common easy to see, right? But we've been doing that for a while in algebra, and so it might have been a while since we saw this this process. So let me just do a quick recap, a conclusion here. 10x squared minus 11x minus 6 is equivalent to 2x minus 3 times 5x plus 2, right? So we factor this trinomial. So I hope that this is helpful. Please let me know if you have